The ballroom smelled of expensive perfume and polished oak. Crystal chandeliers sprinkled light across the rows of seats, and cameras hummed like distant bees. People in silk and tailored suits found their places, murmuring about the latest investments and the charity's success. At the center of it all sat one man, Jonathan Clay, billionaire, philanthropist, and the type of person who measured the world in transactions. He smiled in a way that had been practiced for decades, a smile that said everything and nothing at once. Across from him, at a long table with a sign that read "Honored Guests," was May, a young woman whose dark hair was pinned into a neat bun. Her hands were steady on the programs beneath her palms. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was the interpreter for the domestic staff of the hospital, hired at the last minute to translate for visiting mothers from overseas. She wore a simple dress, not one of the gowns that floated through the room, but she carried herself with a quiet dignity that caught a few observant eyes. Jonathan noticed her first because she was the only one not glancing at him like a portrait. Instead, she scanned the program, her face unreadable. "Bring her to me," he said when he was told she could translate for a group he was personally hosting later that evening. He enjoyed being in control of unpredictable things. The idea of someone who wasn't from his world translating his jokes into another language felt like arranging a small experiment. The more unpredictable, the better the entertainment. "She says she can translate," someone murmured. "Chinese, Cantonese, Mandarin," they added, as if piling exoticism onto a person. When Jonathan invited May to the stage, the reporters leaned forward, cameras swiveling like predatory birds. She stepped up under the chandelier's glow, palms pressed together to still their tremor. He handed her a small stack of papers, a short speech that was to be read to a delegation of doctors and donors from a sister hospital in Shanghai. "Translate it," he said, amused, as if issuing a dare. "If you translate it well, I'll give her mother a job in one of my hospitals. If she fails, she'll have nothing." A bit theatrical, perhaps, but isn't that what we came here for? Laughter spread around the room like an invitation. People sipped champagne, delighted by the spectacle. May felt the weight of all those eyes like a physical thing. She thought of her mother, Anya, who worked 12-hour shifts in a nearby clinic, who patched patients' wounds with a gentleness that no amount of money could buy. Anya's hands had first taught May how to hold a pencil, how to thread a needle, and how to keep hope alive on nights when there was nothing but rice and the sound of the city outside their window. A job at Jonathan Clay's hospital would mean security, respect, something they'd never been offered before. Her voice started soft, then grew firmer with each sentence. The words flowed from her like a river finding its channel, formal, precise, perfectly paced. She translated idioms with care, captured jokes with a deftness that made the listeners, many of them familiar with Mandarin, look up, surprised. She turned bureaucratic phrasing into something warm and human. And when she reached the section where gratitude and partnership were highlighted, her translation added a phrase that wasn't in the original but fit like a hand in a glove, a local proverb about hands that heal. Jonathan's eyebrows rose. He had expected clumsy literalism or nervous paraphrase. He did not expect elegance. When she finished, the room applauded politely. Reporters scribbled notes. A few guests muttered about the audacity of the idea that a staff translator could outperform professionals. But the delegation from Shanghai applauded with genuine warmth. A man in the front stood and, speaking in Mandarin, returned a proverb in kind, a gesture that bridged the room in a way Jonathan hadn't planned. He felt the audience shift. It was as if May had rearranged the pieces on a chessboard and, in doing so, reminded everyone that there are rules higher than money. Mutual respect, shared language, and the human need to be seen. Later, in the quieter halls of the estate, Jonathan caught May by the staircase. "You were good," he said, in praise that tasted like ownership. "Better than I thought." "I only translated what was written," May replied. "I translated with what I felt the words needed. Language belongs to people, not to paper." Jonathan studied her as if examining an object. "Do you know how rare it is to be unafraid in front of so many people?" he asked. "Audacity doesn't need fearlessness," she said. "It needs purpose." He smirked. "Bold words for someone who owes me everything," he said. "You offered a job to my mother if I succeeded," May answered, tidy and factual. Jonathan's smile dimmed. "Consider it a test of talent," he said. "And consider it a lesson in complexity. May replied, "My mother doesn't want charity. She wants fair work, respect, and a seat at a table where her skills matter. If your offer is real, it should come with those things. A job with dignity, not a label in your press release." He left with a polite nod, a nod that said nothing about whether his promises were binding. The next week, a representative called Anya to schedule an interview. May was careful to be present. She watched her mother sit across from a hospital administrator who seemed impressed by Anya's resume and decades of hands-on skill. The administrator smiled, asked the right questions, wrote notes. It seemed promising, until the end, when he cleared his throat and said something that sounded like an afterthought. "The position comes with some limitations. You'll be assigned to less visible wards," he offered, "and leadership roles usually require time and administration." Anya's jaw tightened. "I don't want front-page glory," she said simply. "I want to be allowed to do the full scope of my work. I'm a nurse, not a placeholder." The administrator hesitated. "The system is set up that way," he said. "Training and leadership roles usually require certain credentials and time." May watched the dance. The same script she'd seen for years. Talented people offered crumbs and asked to be grateful. She clenched her hands, feeling the old familiar ache of watching someone she loved settle for less. That evening, May confronted Jonathan at a reception. "You promised more than lip service," she said, voice steady. "You made a spectacle of my family's situation to entertain your guests. If you truly meant for this to change things, then change them now. Give my mother the role with the dignity she deserves." Jonathan laughed at first, the sound crisp and practiced, then the laugh faded. "You speak boldly," he said. "Bold is useful in negotiations. Protocols preserve stability," he added. "We can't just rearrange every institution because one evening got emotional. Protocols that preserve privilege may correct it. You can pay us to be grateful, but that doesn't fix the problem of how people are shut out." A hush fell. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing they were witnessing something private. Jonathan took a measured breath and then offered a compromise, a new position, not the leadership role May had asked for, but a mid-level post with the promise of training. "It's reasonable," he said. "We can't break systems overnight." May's eyes flashed. "Systems were built by people," she said. "People can change them. Start by giving my mother the right to prove herself without being relegated to the margins." Jonathan's face reddened. He made the call that night. The hospital announced a revised position, more responsibility, a clear path to promotion, and an internal oversight panel to ensure fairness. Publicly, it looked like generosity. Privately, it smelled faintly of control. Records were signed. Press releases were drafted. Jonathan felt the thrill of philanthropy, the ability to nudge a system and have people thank him for the motion. Anya started her new role with quiet determination. She tended to patients with steady hands, trained junior staff, and refused to be overlooked. And yet, in the shadows, there were those who whispered that she had only received the job because of a billionaire's whim, as if that tainted her competence. One afternoon, a medical oversight board member questioned her methods in a meeting filled with clipped tones. May watched from the doorway, feeling the weight of centuries of bias pull at the conversation. Anya didn't flinch. She explained her approach, referenced studies, and recalled cases where small shifts in protocol had saved lives. Evidence replaced assumption, and by the end the board nodded. The criticism felt hollow. Word of Anya's success spread slowly, carried by grateful families and nurses she had mentored. People started to ask for her on certain wards. Patients recognized the steady compassion in her hands, and volunteers began to seek training under her. Promotion discussions, once theoretical, became tangible. Jonathan watched the shift with a complex expression. He had tried to prove a point by dangling a job like bait, then watched the spectacle become something else entirely. He'd aimed to orchestrate compassion and found that once released, it had a life of its own. The hospital grew better in pockets, then in routines, and change became less about his approval and more about the community's momentum. At a follow-up gala months later, Jonathan found himself seated to the side of a table where Anya and May spoke with nurses and patients like old friends. He listened as Anya recounted a small miracle, how a newborn had survived a complicated delivery because a patient advocate had insisted on a different positioning during labor. The story rolled through the room and landed with a warmth that had nothing to do with audits or grants. He realized, slowly, that the real leverage wasn't wealth alone. It was people who held skill and used it to lift others without waiting for permission. He felt the sting of being outpaced by compassion. His earlier amusement at May's audacity had become a lesson he hadn't expected to learn. In a quiet moment, Jonathan approached May and Anya. "You changed the hospital," he said, the words stripped of their earlier flourish. "I didn't do it. You did. I only opened the door." Anya smiled. "A door means little when the work behind it isn't valued," she said. "You opened it." "Yes, but remember whose hands kept the lights on." "You speak with truth," Jonathan admitted. "I thought I could orchestrate change from a distance. I didn't understand the inertia of daily life, how systems can grind down intention." May reached out and squeezed her mother's hand. "We accepted help because we needed it," she said. "But we asked for fairness, not pity. When you make offers in public, people listen. Use that. Support the structures that allow people to rise on merit, not just on your favor." Jonathan nodded. He couldn't erase the spectacle he had staged, but he could choose to be better. Over the next year, he funded training programs. Yes, but he also established transparent hiring practices and empowered independent review boards. He learned to step back and let professionals lead, because the work deserved expertise, not PR. Months later, Anya received an official promotion to clinical coordinator on merit. It read as an achievement, not a gift. The hospital staff workshops adopted her methods. Nurses who had once been invisible found avenues for leadership. The change was uneven and ongoing, but it was real. The moment that stayed with Jonathan, though, wasn't the press release or the board meeting. It was a small scene in a hallway. Anya kneeling by a patient, adjusting blankets, laughing softly as she listened to an old man's story about fishing. Nearby, May watched, and Jonathan stood a few steps away, feeling like an observer to something he had once thought he controlled. In the end, the lesson wasn't about charity or power. It was a reminder that when people are given the chance to show their worth, they create their own momentum. May kept translating, but she no longer needed to prove anything to win dignity for her mother. They both walked through the hospital like anyone else, steady, present, and no longer a spectacle for someone else's amusement. Their lives were quieter, perhaps, but they were honored in ways that money alone could never buy. And somewhere in the archive of Jonathan Clay's memories, the night he laughed at a challenge sat like a stone that eventually rolled downhill and helped make a path. Not because of his laugh, but because of the people who refused to let it be the last word.